Well, China is continuing to expand its involvement in police training in the Pacific, despite Australia's efforts to block it. In Vanuatu, a new video posted to social media by China's embassy shows Chinese police riding motorbikes gifted to the Pacific nation in April, while Beijing is also signaling it wants its Coast Guard to play a greater role in the region. But Foreign Affairs reporter Stephen Jedget says the latest developments are unlikely to cause any angst in Canberra and Wellington.
I don't know if it will cause consternation. I suspect that officials in places like Canberra and Wellington, as well as Washington, D.C., are pretty well aware of what China's been doing in Vanuatu. This, in a sense, isn't hugely new. It was 2023 when China first started rolling out police training teams in Vanuatu, not long after it did the same in Solomon Islands. But there's been less focus on Vanuatu, and things have been a bit quieter and less public there. China moving quite carefully in the beginning to try and perhaps not draw too much attention to what it was doing there, fearful of a backlash in places like Australia, which then might, pressure Vanuatu to withdraw these teams. But now what we're seeing, I think, from Beijing is a greater sense of confidence, a sense that it's now well embedded, or these training programs in Vanuatu are well embedded, more generosity from China. So we're not just seeing, for example, those motorbikes, but also 4 patrol boats that were donated by China, gifts of things like drones and riot gear and uniforms for police officers in Vanuatu. And now I think with these videos, which were posted back in April and a few other videos posted before then, a greater sense of confidence and projection. So what they're now trying to do is project China as a normal and natural partner for Pacific Island police forces. It's advertising not just to local media and to politicians in Vanuatu, but also, I think, critically to other countries in the Pacific. Look, here are the goodies and the kit that's on offer if you do cooperate with us. Really what they're trying to do, I guess, here is push back against the attempts that Australia and others have made to really box out Beijing as a major policing and security player. And you're seeing that not just in places like Solomon Islands, but also in places like Vanuatu and Kiribati, which also has a small number of Chinese police officers on the ground. So China hasn't enjoyed overwhelming success here. There are still a number of Pacific nations that have rejected, or at least resisted for now, Chinese attempts to place similar officer training teams on the ground. But in a significant number of countries, it has managed to really embed itself as a long-term policing partner. And I think the fact that it's now extolling the virtues of these programs speaks to its determination to try and expand policing links to other Pacific countries as well.
So, Stephen, what does this then mean for Australia's Pacific Policing Initiative that was endorsed by Pacific Islands leaders last year?
Well, look, Girish, there's no immediate or direct impact on that program. Just to remind viewers who might have very understandably forgotten about this, this was the major policing initiative that Australia unveiled at last year's Pacific Islands Forum leaders meeting that will see hundreds of millions of dollars from Australia ploughed into Pacific policing, new training centres across the Pacific, as well as a major new training facility in Brisbane, a new police unit that will be able to be sent to Pacific nations. Now, that sits alongside what countries like Vanuatu and Solomon Islands are doing here with China. There is, I guess, a bit of an inherent contradiction there. Australia is trying to create the PPI not just to bolster capability, but also because it wants to try and occupy as much space as possible in the policing sphere, trying to stop China from making new inroads. I don't think the fact that China has nonetheless actually achieved a bit of success in Solomon Islands and Vanuatu is any sort of hammer blow against the PPI's credibility. And in a sense, what's happening with the PPI is much more sweeping and ambitious than what we're seeing in places like Vanuatu and Solomon Islands. But I think Beijing will be encouraged because what it's trying to tell these Pacific nations is, look, you can have your cake and eat it too. You can sign up if you really want to these Pacific elite policing initiatives with Australia, but make sure you retain some space for us. And if you do, then we're going to be able to assist you with training programs and also, perhaps most importantly, with equipment that your Pacific police forces really want. So it sits pretty uncomfortably against the Pacific Policing Initiative, but Australia won't be deterred. It will try and press ahead with this whilst sending the message to countries like Solomon Islands and Vanuatu that they're a bit of an outlier and that in the view of Australia anyway, they should quietly wind down these programs with China.
And on the maritime front, Stephen, we now know, according to the Lowy Institute, that China has 26 Coast Guard vessels registered in the region. What is Beijing signaling here, and what might it mean for the Pacific in the future?
Well, I think it's signalling ambition and intent, basically, Girish. Now, just one thing to note there, that China has moved to register these vessels with the Commission that actually has responsibility for these vast fisheries throughout the Pacific, but that process isn't yet complete. It still has to get the tick off from the Commission. So until that happens, China won't be able to send these vessels out onto the high seas. But I think when you look at this registration, which happened last year, along with the recent demonstration that China hosted for Pacific foreign ministers in Xiamen at the sidelines of their meeting with China's foreign minister, where they basically took Pacific foreign ministers on board one of their massive Coast Guard ships and hosted a maritime safety drill. What these two things are signalling is that China wants to send more of its Coast Guard out into the Pacific, and that it wants its Coast Guard vessels to have a responsibility doing things like regulating illegal fishing in the region. Now, there are some interesting things to note here. The first, of course, is that China's Coast Guard has been used very effectively by Beijing as essentially a paramilitary force in places like the South China Sea. And so I suspect countries like Australia and the US and others who have substantial presence regulating fishing in the region already will be very wary of any Chinese Coast Guard presence. The other thing, of course, to note here, Girish, on top of that, is that the largest fleets that are responsible often for illegal and unregulated fishing in the Pacific are connected to China and Taiwan, even if they're operating under different flags. Now, in the case of China, there's already sort of murmurs out there that Pacific nations are often very reticent to confront illegal Chinese fishing in the region. I can't imagine that Chinese Coast Guard vessels would necessarily be that keen to do the same. In the case of Taiwan, well, there are also some interesting political questions there, of course, because of the ongoing political impasse between Taiwan and China. Exactly what would Chinese Coast Guard vessels do if they confronted Taiwanese illegal fishers? All of these are really difficult and fraught questions, and I think as China starts to move into the Coast Guard space more actively, countries across the region will have to confront that. The other thing, of course, is that I think Western countries in particular will see a presence of the Coast Guard as another precursor to a greater Chinese military presence. We're already seeing, of course, far more Chinese military vessels on the high seas, including around Australia, but also last year visiting, for example, ports in Vanuatu. If you take the Coast Guard into these places, you also get essentially more awareness on the Chinese side of the maritime domain that they're looking to increasingly exert power throughout. So plenty of reasons there for countries like Australia, the US and New Zealand to be watching with quite a great deal of caution.
Okay, Stephen Jedgetts in Canberra. We'll leave it there, but thank you so much.
Thanks, Girish.